Connaissance, recherche,
sciences,
mathématiques,
théorie,
physique, philosophie,
conférences,
archéologie,
nature.
So I'd like to welcome you here this morning. I'm I'm sitting on the board of directors of the Collège de France. Je souhaiterais vous accueillir ici. Donc vous pouvez avoir interprétation vers le français sur le canal 1. So I'd like to welcome you here simply to say that the Collège de France has taken the following initiative, or taken a number of initiatives, very robust initiatives over the last few years, by setting up annual research chairs deliberately focused upon major social issues. And in 2008, 2009, we set up two of these research chairs. First, knowledge against poverty, and the second one, sustainable development, environment, energy, and society. So, knowledge against poverty. This particular research chair was inaugurated by Esther Duflo. She gave a battery of lessons that people came to listen to those in great numbers. And today we have a colloquium, a 48-hour colloquium, if I can term it that way, focusing on this major topic, knowledge against poverty. And that's the title of our colloquium. And evaluation of development policies, crossing paths, researchers and practitioners. So I must say, by way of introduction, that by setting up this research chair, Knowledge Against Poverty, we knew full well that the variety of stakeholders, the multiplicity of vested interests, the necessary respect of men and women in culture means that the scope of human activity is one of the most complex out there. We thought that it was important to have a cross-disciplinary approach in order to look in a deep-seated fashion into this area. Scientific skills, economists provide their input, also grassroots players, practitioners, if I can term them that way, to basically furnish us with their experience with regard to how things are occurring in the developing countries. We thought it was crucial to strike up a dialogue about funding, which obviously goes hand in hand with the analysis that maybe we wish to undertake. Poverty requires a quantum leap of generosity with regard to funding, but that needs to be built on rigorous analysis and without indulgence with regard to the resources that need to be brought to bear. So I'm delighted that the agenda very clearly mirrors that bold ambition, and Esther Duflo in her lessons and through this colloquium is really stepping up to the mark. This is an approach, I'm a doctor, this approach is perfectly coherent with grassroots doctors, economists as well, as I said, and scientists, and the approach therefore is underpinned on a rigorous approach with regard to medicine, and this makes it possible to decide on which strategy we wish to undertake to get from A to B. Now, medicine has changed considerably over the last few years with evidence-based medicine, and then it turned to evidence-based public health, and I feel, for my part, that this is a very interesting realm, and I think it's very important to adopt that proof-based theory when we think about knowledge against poverty. So the battery of lessons given by Professor Duflo made a huge splash, really. And so we could extend the scope of those lessons thanks to their considerable dissemination over the Collège de France website. Last year, we had 5 million hours worth of lessons that were downloaded right across all scientific disciplines. These can be downloaded on podcasts. Now we're on Multimedia iTunes U University. And so therefore this colloquium will be available in French and in English in 1 or 2 days' time on the Collège de France website. Now, so in order to do that, in order to be able to invite colleagues from abroad, well, obviously, we needed robust support and a huge amount of interest on the part of stakeholders in order to be able to get where we are today. And this was made possible thanks to the French Development Agency, which very generously provided the support for the research chair, Knowledge Against Poverty, and therefore this colloquium. I'd like to thank Mr. Severino, who is the General Director of the French Development Agency, and we're lucky enough to have his right-hand man, Jean-Michel Debrat, from that very agency. So, I'd like to thank you. I'd like thank you for your attention. I hope you have a fantastic colloquium, and without further ado, I'll hand over to Esther Duflo in order to place the scientific debate that we'll be dealing with today in its proper context. Thank you very much. So, thank you very much. I'm going to present Jean-Michel Debrat, and who is Deputy General Director of the French Development Agency. Now, this body supports this research chair, and that's why we are here at the Collège de France today, and I'm very grateful for his presence and the support by the AFD. But obviously, their presence goes over and beyond that, because obviously the issue that we're going to be broaching today, that of the effectiveness of aid, the effectiveness of programs or methods that are hoped to be the most appropriate to mitigate poverty. That, of course, is the core business, if you like, of AFD, and that's why it's particularly important that the agency be represented here today. And so it's with a great pleasure that I am welcoming Jean-Michel Debrat. Over to you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Esther, I obviously appreciate the fact that of being invited here to Collège de France, whose illustrious name is appropriate to be able to open this colloquium. We have an agenda which is extremely enriching. Now, I think it is important, obviously, to hold 1 or 2 introductory remarks for any colloquium that's important, but suffice it to say, in a word, that I'd like to talk about 3 salient points that I think, I have no doubt, that I think will really feed into what runs in the very DNA of the French Development Agency. Now, this is a very singular body because it is at once a bank, because we were set up to finance development. That is our bread and butter business, if you will. But obviously the funding is cast into shade by our concerns in and of themselves. In other words, concerns bearing upon running probant analyses on developing countries. And that's why we wish to fashion ideas or even foster thinking within think tanks in universities, not only in France but elsewhere, to be able to help us get to where we want to go. And this will be the last remark on the AFD. It is customary for me to present AFD in the following way. We're a third bank, third university, and you stir that around, and then you get a third, which is the melded version, which is the AFD. So the AFD, like other development agencies, deplores a kind of a lack of momentum, or the fact that development issues are losing momentum in the public arena. And then we talk about fatigue. In the 1990s, aid fatigue. That was something that was used to describe this losing of momentum with regard to funding. And so now we're wondering whether we're actually seeing in the year 2000 a losing momentum, or a loss of momentum rather, with regard to interest in analysis performed in this area. Now, of course, there were the United Nations Millennium Goals, there was the direction of Paris, and those statements, those public statements, seemed to mean that things were going in the right direction, and this analysis performed on the efficaciousness of aid, but that seems to be losing steam. So the AFD, at its level, of course, in its modest way, promotes and funds thinking upon development issues in France, at France's level, but also in the international arena. And that's why we wanted to provide support to the research chair of the Collège de France in order to support these efforts about breathing fresh life into this and to gaining fresh momentum. So we're delighted that Professor Duflo has decided to retain the topic knowledge against poverty as the subject of her research chair. So over and beyond experiments run on the ground and stakeholders who are involved in that are in this very room, obviously that is meaningful in the scientific arena, but also in the development arena. What do I mean by that? I mean that throws up debate, and the scope of that debate is critical, and that's a good sign. Now, it seems as though we could go from a very simple statement about what happens on the grassroots level. Now, we could also look at what's hiding behind the word grassroots level, but and that, I think, underscores this idea of being a proximity player. And I like the comparison you drew up in your introductory remarks in this respect, because at the beginning and the end, if you like, there is analysis and observation that's made, and then there's an end result which are all palpable, and there's obviously shuttling back between the both. And so I think we need to focus on that. Now, this school of thought is giving rise to a new understanding of poverty, which I would say the observation, the analysis, and the causes and the remedies to poverty is something that has been thought about over the last 20 years considerably. We didn't deal with things in that way even 50 years ago. So this understanding of poverty, quite obviously, is a moral issue. But in addition to that, it is a social science, human science issue. The extreme inequality of distribution of revenue and access to particular social services of entire countries or even regions of the world, particularly in developing worlds, but not only in developing world, right across all countries. And so the question of development isn't only something that concerns developing world, but it's something that is very important for those who are very developed from a macroeconomic point of view. So our focus for today and tomorrow will be the following. Once again, we're seeing a return to the fact that knowledge is one of the best weapons to fight against poverty. We can't just be, even though it's easy to say this in political rhetoric, even though it's easy to talk about, to use slogans, catchy sound bites, we're talking about a proper object of study here. Now, the AFD, and this is the second point that I want to talk about, the AFD, with its own resources, has got involved in funding and the steering of impact studies, impact evaluation studies. Now, we've been involved in about a dozen or so of these operations, and two are underpinned by random evaluations. In Morocco, with microfinance, with MNAC, which is the major not-for-profit association dealing with that area today, and Mr. Amouni is in this room, and he'll be speaking on the floor, speaking on this very rostrum later on, with Esther Duflo's lab. He works in conjunction with that. And there's another experiment in Cambodia this time with health, with the micro-funding of that in conjunction with the Phnom Penh University. In addition to that, AFD tries to improve its mitigation strategies to fight against poverty and to actually reduce the lack of understanding of the impact of development programs and development policies. And then we like to strike up a link between the world that two worlds that don't work easily together, research and evaluation on the one hand, and then politics and politicians on the other. So measuring the effects of these latter deserves to be the major focus of development research today. This will enable us to go over and beyond experts' reports, which aren't bad in and of themselves, but often often just are the only advisors that politicians listen to. So we want to basically make sure that rigorous evaluations are more fully conjoined with more relevant studies. Now, over and beyond that, we'll be increasingly exploring difficult questions, one of which being that of sampling, allocation of results, the way you actually perform your studies, the way you actually glean your results and your findings. So I think on the format and the substance, it's very important to think about that. But what is of particular interest to us, over and beyond those questions, which are in and of themselves not very straightforward, is the question of how do you interpret the findings and the readings as soon as you leave a particular area of experience. So if you look at the history of a given community, and by looking at the past and looking into the future, we try to draw consequences. Now the waters become even muddier to understand and interpret experience, which in and of itself is not easy. And so you can see that the AFD is particularly interested in this, because the only demonstration that we can make is how things improve is if things are sustainable and they're long-standing, and that can justify, with hindsight, the policies that were embarked upon initially. So this encounter between people from different professional disciplines, political stakeholders and practitioners, the encounter between these stakeholders is really at the nub of this conference. And this will be the third area of interest that I'd like to talk about when talking about the feasibility of studies. Now, there's a major stake, which is underpinned by the need for stakeholders to work together, and it's not the most easiest of things. We are using AFD's experience, but I can make a distinction between three different stakeholders represented here in this colloquium. Obviously, there's scientists, there are grassroots players, practitioners, if you will, and there are also what the English or the Anglo-Saxons called the policymakers, or the political decision makers, or the financial sponsors, because these latter are decision makers, obviously, in the process, even though their legitimacy is not necessarily fully fledged in the eyes of the public domain. So, now, these various players don't often have the same goals and offer up the same questions. Now, some think about scale and magnitude, and they look at costs. They want value for money compared with other types of input or contribution, and that's the concern, obviously, of political public policymakers. In other words, those people who are responsible, who are accountable to the public. The second area of concern is that involves forging a link, a scientific link, provide evidence to support a link between what is the innovation that is appraisable. When I'm thinking about health, I'm thinking about providing maybe insurance technique, and on the other hand, the offering of the care, this medical care, because that's, after all, the goal. And then thinking about the type of insurance, thinking about the behaviours of households, and then at the other end of the scale, medical behaviour faced with medical care. So all that's important, and doctors and economists are obviously have some amount of experience with regard to what I've just referred to. Now, there are also scientific questions that stem from the very techniques for targeting, for investigation, that's important as well. So these got these three expectations, threefold, all legitimate, and the focus on three different preoccupations with regard to the impact, and are cross-cutting with regard to the way that evaluations are used. Now, decision makers use these evaluations in order to choose between avenue A, B, or C, or D, just like a doctor does, about thinking, given a given diagnosis, what what avenue of care should he go down. And so this is obviously crucial for a decision maker to choose between various options and to allocate appropriate methods with regard to programs. Now, then we've got the practitioners who obviously are waiting or expecting an improvement of their policy and their practices, their grassroots practices. And then, of course, there's the general scientific concerns and they're hoping that the stock of international knowledge will be improved following the decisions made by these policymakers. So, to give you a kind of a coordinated answer to these three sets of expectations, I suppose the starting point is to say, okay, this isn't just going to happen overnight, and it's not. I mean, that might seem self-evident, but you need a thought-through strategy, an explicit, assertive strategy, in order to be able to reconcile these three approaches. Now, one of these approaches sometimes tries to encroach on the other and cast it in the shade. So the researchers, all along the way, need to think about how they're using their research. Policymakers need to get on board right from the outset and right to the end, and also be involved in the debate upon the findings. And then the most difficult part is not that at all. And what's most difficult, of course, is to, and this brings me back to my anecdote of, a third bank, a third administration, and I talked about the AFD. You've got to organise and coordinate theory and practice. You've got to understand the skill sets that are at play, and this needs to be thought of upstream. So make sure that everybody's on board and going down the right direction, and so that things can run smoothly. So those are the concerns, if you will, that could be ours, reconciling those three professional realms, thinking about impacts, the three expectations. I'm making it simple, but three expectations with regard to the use of the knowledge. We at the AFD, we thought that was really the heart of any experimental evaluation operation. So it's this encounter that I mentioned earlier on that is crucial for innovation, and it is part and parcel of innovation. And we are faced with a trend of thinking which is the very object of this, very subject of this colloquium. And that's why I wish this colloquium to be a great success, because we're facing challenges which are so complicated from a social point of view, but they're complex, and so therefore they are vast from a territorial, economic, demographic and financial point of view. Innovation from this point of view is crucial. It's crucial because we are convinced that it's in its trickle-down effect or in its consequences that it's through those consequences that success can be found in mitigating issues faced by development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Administrator, Mr. Director of AFD, dear colleagues, and especially those of you coming from far away, dear friends, dear colleagues. Welcome. This conference is very important to me because that's the achievement of huge effort from researchers, political decision makers, people from various organizations and NGOs, and having organized this conference within Collège de France before you is a genuine achievement and should lead to something that will help change public policies, and that goes beyond those who are with us today. It's a movement comprising students, professors, people working in the field, fighting against poverty, and sharing this belief that we will only be able to make headways in fighting against poverty if we can combine action and research to evaluate the impact of initiatives and programs in a rigorous manner. So I want to thank my colleagues from Collège de France who had the idea of these chair. And I wanted to say that I didn't have the idea of this title, Knowledge Against Poverty. That was an idea of the Collège de France. And I also want to thank AFD, which funded this program so that we can meet today here. The various presentations over the upcoming 2 days combine a researcher who has worked and led a specific study on microfinance, on health, education, politics, etc., and someone working in the field. As you will see if you read the biography of these people, we'll listen to CEOs of microfinance institutions, academics, and people working in the field with NGOs. So these pioneers we'll be listening to in the coming 2 days have had an impact on the lives of millions of people, and many of them have had an impact on the lives of millions of people for each of them. And I know that these are very busy people, so I'm very grateful they managed to join us today, so I want to wish them a very warm welcome here. So why did we ask these very busy people to join us? Why did we have this idea of having an academic and somebody working in the field giving a joint presentation? Well, because these combined visions aim at illustrating the mutual fertilization of a practice on the researcher side and on the side of those working in the field who have a hands-on knowledge of what's going on in the field. So I'll talk to you about these issues during my inaugural lecture in January. Researchers can come up with a practice and can fine-tune ideas suggested by others and understand how practices can meet an objective and if they could be efficient or not. But on the other hand, and in a symmetrical way, practice feeds research, because it's when we understand how such behavior has an impact, why such factor has an impact of behavior, that we'll better understand why poverty persists and how we can escape poverty. So there is a back and forth movement between research and practice, which I see on a totally equal footing, and this is why this dialogue is something that I wanted to demonstrate and illustrate here today. So of course it's always possible to organize similar types of conferences. It's always possible to bring together scientists and researchers who would accept to meet in Paris on a beautiful day of June, because all people working in the field of development know that at the end of a study there is a conference bringing together researchers and stakeholders. This word was coined within the framework of international institutions, and this word has no translation in French, but at the end of any study we have a conference with researchers and stakeholders, but very often this is just a very formal conference. This is not what I wanted. What's specific today is that this conference and these relationships we have are not new, that the scientists you'll be listening to have had long-lasting relationships with people working in the field, and their relationships date back 10 years or more in some cases. And the reason why these are very old relationships is because those people working in the field are full-fledged partners within the research that we're going to present, or full-fledged partners in other similar types of research. Sometimes we ask a partner within study A to comment on study B, to have a functional vision of these programs. These are the people who initiated these projects most of the times, who always contributed to these projects and worked on the sometimes crazy ideas of researchers. And it's the very nature of research presented today that required these very narrow cooperations. So it's not kind of a byproduct. Oh, we need and meet with people in the field. No, it's because research was rigorous that it required relationships to be established with people working in the field. And this right from the outset. Why? Because all the projects we're going to talk about today, except for one, are randomized studies. And I use this term randomized studies to Mr. Corval. I didn't know we were allowed to use the word randomized in French, but apparently we are. So, in order to determine the impact of a program, and just taking the example of the first presentation to determine the impact of microfinance, we randomly select a certain number of people, villages, schools in a determined geographical area, and we have a test panel and a control panel. The microfinance program we're going to talk about today was implemented in Hyderabad in India, and we selected 120 districts, and in these 120 districts we selected 60 districts in a random fashion in which we implemented the program. So we started the study before the program was implemented, during the entire duration of the program, all the way till we considered that the program had been implemented for long enough a time to have a real impact. So in the case of microfinance, after the program was launched, we waited a period of 2 years for people to have time to borrow money, for these loans to have time to have an impact on the life of people, and so that the impact could be seen on investments, consumption, etc. So this method, as Mr. Corval said, it was inspired from clinical tests in medicine. No one would think of putting a drug on the market before testing the effects of this drug within the framework of a similar type of study. But that wasn't the case so far for social programs, which are very often adopted on a large scale based on some anecdotes or based on the enthusiasm of one person. And that leads to effects of trends, and that leads to implementing a program on a large scale without its results being analyzed. And this leads to discussions on the relevance of adopting such and such policy, turn into a kind of speeches rather than a real discussion based on facts. And that has an impact because, first, public money can be ill spent if invested in programs which prove to be inefficient. That's at practical level. And then it's an opportunity that we miss to better understand human behavior. And if a program fails, that can be useful to understand how we can move from this failure to a success just by adapting the program. So if a program fails, if we understand why it failed, that can be just as important as a success, as long as the reason for failures are well analyzed. And when programs fail and they're not analyzed, that's a lot of knowledge which is lost for the future, and that prevents us from understanding why we ended up in such a high level of poverty. Third aspect, that the public very often gets discouraged and they are tired of providing aid to combat poverty. In these days, the uselessness of aid or the uselessness of redistribution is very often supported by the idea that anyway, no program leads to nowhere. So for these three reasons, not wasting public money understanding why a program is successful or is a failure, and 3, ensure better support to these programs. For these 3 reasons, we need to better understand these programs, and we need to carry out rigorous evaluation trials. But to achieve that, we need to have a narrow cooperation between the group implementing the program, whether an NGO, a private company, a bank, a government, and a group in charge of evaluating the program. So, unlike a clinical study, evaluation is not carried out in a lab but in the field, and very often researchers are not the most appropriate people to implement a program. They can evaluate the program, but they can't implement the program. So they need partners who can not only launch the program but can also accept the various inconvenience like randomization. It's sometimes difficult to accept, but the problems only start with randomization. Once randomization has been accepted, you need to comply with a protocol. It's very difficult to change the type of program halfway through, because in that case you no longer know what you're assessing. You need to collect appropriate and relevant data. You need to accept the requests from researchers who all of a sudden need something for yesterday so that they can submit their proposal for funding in due time, etc., etc. So these are intense corporations which are very demanding on people in the field. And I want to pay tribute to these people today. So beyond these successful corporations between researchers and people in the field, like Pratam, represented by our colleague here, it's in order to encourage the emergence of these systematic relationships between researchers and partners that, along with Benechi and Esther, my colleagues here, we created the JEPAN, which is the Laboratory for Action Against Poverty. More than a laboratory, it's a network of researchers. It's a network of more than 30 scientists working on more than 30 projects in more than 20 countries. And our ambition today is to have an impact on millions of lives, not directly through our action, but thanks to the adoption of more efficient and fairer policies. And the fairness of these policies will be demonstrated by our studies. Our beginnings were a bit bumpy. 10 years ago, very few people believed that randomized studies were feasible or useful. We are very grateful to our partners who never listened all the theoretical discourses proving why it wouldn't work, and who accepted to start on this journey with us. They never had any hesitations, just like us, and they felt we had to do things to see where that would lead us. After these bumpy start, things started to improve quite dramatically, and the first evaluations with Pratam demonstrated the usefulness and feasibility of such a methodology. Other partners joined us, and this is how we managed to have a narrow cooperation with other funding institutions. So thanks to this enthusiasm, we set up JEPAL with 3 objectives. 1, carry out quality studies, then teach others to carry out such studies through training and practice. So now we have 100 employees, very often young people, some of them being in the room today, and they dedicate 1 year, 2 years of their life in the field, working on the study and getting trained to do that. And the 3rd objective was to have an impact on millions of people, to encourage the adoption of the most efficient programs. So those programs assessed as being efficient by our works at one time or another have an impact on 30 million people today, and we hope to go further now that we have a whole collection of knowledge that we can share. So in these 2 days, you'll have the opportunity of listening to various projects being described. We'll talk about microfinance today. We'll talk about politics and governance this afternoon, then health and education, then employment and job markets in France. So this will be the French example. And those of you who listened to my lectures in January has heard a lot about the various projects that will be presented here today. But in my lectures, I didn't have time to go in the nitty-gritty of each individual project. And it's by listening to all researchers and stakeholders in the field, explaining to you the difficulties they were faced with and the successes of each project and problems with each project that will better understand how powerful this approach is. So this is my hope for these upcoming 2 days, and I wish you an excellent conference.